And this is our last but one class on Science Has Changed, the book Science Has Changed, this book here. And we have one class to go, which is on the book of Revelation, and that will be the week after next, after the break. But anyway, what we're doing today is taking a step back, and we're looking at some of the material in the introduction. And the importance of this, to do this, is because, you know, all during Science of Change, we've been telling a story, obviously. And I've been trying to develop the story, and we have been developing the story together, which is really important because, you know, stories are part and parcel of the fabric of our minds. It's actually one of the ways in which our minds are built. I mean, there are other things as well, and it's all to do with relationships. You know, when you're a little child, the relationships, but your immediate relationships are with your parents, and, you know, that first look of your mother is so important. But little by little, you begin telling your child a story, some kind of story. They're little kids' stories, but you begin expanding their world for them. And so I'm sure it is part of the kind of physical architecture of the brain to actually have stories and story presented to us. And we all inhabit a story. We inhabit the story of the United States, very much so. And the United States has a very strong founding story and identity, all that kind of stuff. And to think about the story of Christianity and the story of the Bible is huge. And for us to try to enter into it in a new way, in talking about nonviolence, the nonviolent God, is something to do with changing the architecture of our brain. It really is. And along with that goes our behavior, our way of being in the world, and our better way of being together, our relationships. And so we're going to back up today and think about some of the story that we've already been told, that we were told, and perhaps we didn't even realize we were being told it. I'm sure we didn't realize. We didn't realize as children, as people going to church, the implicit kind of story world that we are in. And this is very much the same for Catholics and Protestants. I'm pretty sure. I mean, there's a few details in terms of how the mechanism works overall, but the basic storyline is the same. And it's got, and the Protestant Reformation has a lot to do with that, to do with this storyline, trying to kind of get it straight in a way. Anyway, we're looking at a figure called Augustine. Thank you. I got a cup of tea here now. I'm going to pause and drink a little sip of tea. Thank you. Thank you. Everybody's smiling. Thank God I have mostly loving mothers on this on this call. We're thinking about this guy Augustine. Now, Augustine became a Christian something like about the year 375. I'm not entirely sure those dates, but something like 375. So it was in the latter half of the 4th century. And he had an absolutely incalculable effect on Christianity in the West. And you understand that Christianity is large. There's, you know, as well as the Protestant Catholic divide, there's also the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic divide. We don't often think about the Eastern Christian tradition because it, you know, we've been separated. There was what they call a schism, a break in the church back in the 11th century, and it's still not fully repaired. But that was a political thing more than a theological thing. So our main focus is in the West, and the influence of this man, Augustine, as I say, was incalculable in our Western world. And if we go to the introduction and go to page 24 in the book in Latin numerals. It talks at the bottom about this man Augustine, and it says, it quotes this guy called Jerome, and Jerome was a contemporary of Augustine's. And Jerome is responsible for the what is called the Vulgate, the main translation of the main Latin translation of the Bible that was with the church really for 1,000 years until Luther came, and then afterwards it was with the Catholic Church and through into the 19th century, I think. But then the new translations came online. So Jerome in his own right was an incredibly powerful figure. You know, once you present a translation and certain texts have a certain translation, then you're shaping people's minds. But this guy Jerome, himself of so much prestige, wrote to Augustine and said, "You are known throughout the world. Catholics honor and esteem you as the one who has established anew the ancient faith." So that's at the bottom of page 24. It means that it says that you're as big as the apostles, at least as apostles, and are up there with Jesus and the Holy Spirit because you established the ancient faith. So Augustine on his own was able to influence the cultural world of his time to such an extent that he was known as establishing again, becoming the founder. Actually, in Latin, it's even stronger. You were the founder all over again of the ancient faith. And then I quote someone called Dearman McCulloch, who says, Augustine's impact on Western thought can hardly be overstated. Only his beloved example, Paul of Tarsus, has been more influential, and Westerners have generally seen Paul through Augustine's eyes. So he's saying only Paul has been more influential than Augustine, and then normally we've understood Paul through Augustine. So, you know, like if you can think about somebody in your family who has been very influential, the matriarch or the patriarch, and they could be dead, but you know, somebody who's actually shaped the identity of your family. Think about that, and then multiply that person by, let's say, 500 million, and that would be Augustine. He has this incredible influence. And so we have to understand what he was saying. And in essence, what he said, he had two things were of major impact for him, and he worked that out over probably 30 years of his life. He wrote a tremendous amount of material. He just wrote and wrote, and that writing influenced the Middle Ages enormously. Influenced everybody's thinking all the way through to the Reformation. Luther himself was influenced by Augustine to not an inconsiderable degree. There was a kind of form of Augustinianism that was around at his time, and it affected him greatly. So you can see how deep the threads went. But the two things I'm thinking of, one was connected to Augustine's own personal life, and that was his overcoming his spiritual world for that he had been in his 20s. So Augustine grew up as a fairly privileged young man, and he had a fairly kind of dissolute life. I mean, it wasn't dissolute in the way, you know, it wasn't drugs and rock and roll, but it was, you know, like he had a mistress, he had a number of mistresses, and he had them from his late teenage years, as was the custom in those times. That was for a young man of his kind of social standing. And he had that mistress for 12 years until he was becoming a Christian, and his mother got rid of her his mother, who's named Monica, and she was a saint, she sent this woman home from Italy, where he moved back to North Africa. But anyway, all during that time, and there was no problem for him being in that kind of semi-pagan world. He belonged to a group called the Manichaeism. Manichaeism is famous, very famous, because it splits the whole world into two. It says the world is made by two gods, a good God and a bad God. And all the good things in the world obviously come from the good God, and the bad things come from the bad God. And Augustine belonged to that sect. He wasn't a full member. He was what they call a hearer, or a catechumen, should we say, for 10 years. And he had difficulties with that, because there are obviously logical difficulties. The question is, where do those two gods come from? And how come they have the right to divvy up the world the way they do? And isn't that a pretty crazy system, all the rest of it? But it was a very neat way of explaining evil, that there was a bad God who created bad things, and there's not much you could do about it. And so, if I'm sure it went along with having a mistress as well, if that's the bit of me that's, the selfish and sensual side, then I will, that's the bit that's made by the bad God. And I'm not entirely sure how it was all meant to work out, but obviously Augustine had his problems with it, and he was waiting for this great Manichaean master to turn up and show him the answer to his questions. And the master came along, and he had no answers to his questions. So Augustine was thoroughly disgusted and kind of left that group. And at the same time, he encountered the Christians. Now, he was to some degree attracted by Christianity, because Christians seemed to be fairly decent people, and they were growing in power. There's no doubt about it, because they had been made official by the Roman Empire about 60 years before, and many of them were getting into high status. But he didn't like the Bible, because the Bible just seemed to be full of crazy stories, and it was even crazier than Manichaeism as far as he could see. But little by little, he became attracted to it, and then he discovered the works of Plato. So this is a major thing that helped him become a Christian, or helped him fully commit to Christianity. He understood what he called the teachings of the Platonists. He called them Platonists, but really it was a guy called Plotinus, who most scholars think was behind Augustine's thinking at this time, not Plato as such, but a guy called Plotinus. And from Plotinus, he understood that God was spiritual, and that the spiritual world was very, very different from the material world. And the material world was something of a mistake. So rather than there being a difference between a good God and a bad God, there was a difference between the spiritual world and the material world, which had its defects and problems. And this world, according to Plotinus, had been brought about because spiritual souls, so this is the teaching of Plotinus, spiritual souls, totally spiritual souls, that is timeless, bodiless, eternal, intellectual souls, whose job was essentially just to contemplate. That was their job, just to look at the divine one. That was the name they gave it, the one, the unity of the divine, God, the eternal, the one. Their job was to remain in rapt contemplation of the eternal beauty of God. They decided through pride and independence that they wanted to have a little bit of a realm of influence themselves. They didn't want just to be looking at God all the time. So that was the fall. The moment they made that decision, they wanted something else, they actually created the material world. The material world in Plotinus was created out of the proud independence of the souls, the spiritual souls, turning away from the divine one, and then creating this independent space that was always broken. It was broken from the beginning because it came from a wrong decision, and that the things that we see around us all the time are the result of that wrong decision. But the point of this teaching from Plotinus was that by contemplation, by thinking these thoughts and remaining in kind of holy obedience and keeping your attention fixed on the divine one through contemplation, philosophical thought, you could little by little return to your previous status. So there was this, essentially, it was an image, it was a story of fall, and that's where our word fall comes from, the fall. It's not a biblical word, it actually comes from this tradition, this Platonic tradition. So the job of the soul is to get back into unity with the divine one. Now, this helped Augustine enormously. He understood what the spiritual was, not a good God opposed to a bad God, but a spiritual God in separation from a material world. And that actually fixed Augustine's worldview for him. And he was able to commit himself fully to Christianity as a result, because he had his philosophical questions were answered about the nature of God. And the understanding of the Bible came progressively to him, especially through the teaching of someone called Ambrose, a saint who became a saint, who was teaching in Milan in Italy. And he taught what he called the allegorical or symbolic meaning of the Bible. A lot of the difficult things that seem ridiculous could be explained away as just allegories or symbols of a higher truth. So little by little, Augustine got his intellectual worldview straight, and then committed his life to God, to the Christian God, and he did so with great joy and kind of spiritual intellectual satisfaction. He wrote a very, very famous book called the Confessions, one of the major books of the West. It's had huge influence on the West, and it's the story of his conversion. And those things I've been telling you about there come in that book, and it has some very, very beautiful passages. He's a great writer in Latin, and then it translates, and you can feel the power of it. And he wrote that book, and then he went on to write numerous other books, commentaries on the scriptures, and a book on the Trinity, which had a huge influence. And then his last great book was called The City of God. So that was the other major influence, along with the idea of the soul, which I will speak about more in a moment. He understood the world, the body of the Christians, as a city whose destiny was in heaven. And the world around, the city of men, as he called it, the city of men, which is a lot modeled on Rome, the actual city of Rome, was a city of power, of lust, of corruption. And the city of God had to kind of coexist with this earthly city, the human city, on its way to its divine goal, its divine objective in heaven. And that the definition of a city was a group of people combined together by what they loved. And that was a new definition at this time. The city of men is defined by their love for power, for glory, for the things of this world. And the city of God the citizens of the city of God are defined by their love for God, and their love for heaven. So with those two features, the understanding of the soul and the understanding of the role and destiny of the church, Augustine shaped a world, and that world has largely been with us ever since. Now, I got some more to explain that will really make it very, very graphic for you, the way it all worked, especially in terms of the soul and its relationship to sexuality. But are you with me so far? How are you doing? You know, I'm getting thumbs up here. Oh, you're so glorious. You certainly belong in the city of God. There's no doubt about that. Okay. Well, so to cut a long story short, when Augustine turned to the Bible, and especially Genesis, the book of Genesis, he met a very different world from his world of Plotinus's thought of the spiritual realm and then the material realm. He met a God who was very involved in the material stuff. And there were different versions of what this God was doing, and it was hard to get a coherent explanation. But he's looking essentially at what is called the second creation account in chapter 2 of Genesis, and he's saying about how God created Adam and Eve, and they were in the Garden of Eden and they were perfectly happy, but then they sinned. And so this is Genesis, and he's a Christian now, and he has to explain this, and they get kicked out of the garden. So what he does is that he mashes up, I mean, like, put it in contemporary language, he mashes up the Platinian fall of the soul with the Garden of Eden story. He puts them both together. So rather than Adam and Eve kind of just being in this garden and refusing God's command not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then thrown out of the garden, this is also a fall. So the two things are happening together, the way he tells it. So if we go now to my book, you'll see, and this is where it gets very real. And we're on page 26 in the book. And he's writing about the soul sinning.
Tony, are we in 26 of the introduction?
Yes, we are. Yes,
oh,
we
okay.
are. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay. Roman numerals, everyone.
Yes, that's blessings.
Okay.
blessings. See, we're talking about Augustine, so we should be using Roman numerals. But anyway, we're in 26 here, and I'm at the first quotation there. So quoting this quotation about the soul, and I mean, just the language. I can recognize this language from my upbringing. Not the passage, but I can recognize the language. And he says, so the soul turns away from God. Now, this is an excerpt. He wrote a lot of things, but this is an excerpt that shows very strongly that Platinian background. And slithers and slides down. Moviturque et labiter. So it's sliding down. The fall, the soul is sliding down into less and less, which is imagined to be more. So the soul wants its stuff. That's each of us. We want our stuff, whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. It's got to be something that's mine, you know? But when that's happening, we're falling, we're slipping down into this mud. It can find satisfaction neither in itself nor in anything else as it gets further away from him alone who can satisfy it. So that seems entirely the Platinian worldview. The only thing that can satisfy our soul is the contemplation of God. And yet at the same time, we want our own stuff and we get distracted from it. and we slip and slide down into the world of the material order, and we're unhappy. And then he goes on. Come see if you can contemplate God. So he's challenging the soul. That is the spiritual soul. He says, come on, see if you can contemplate God. Oh, soul, weighed down with the body that decays. So you can see the division between the soul and the body there. And burdened with many invariable earthly thoughts. Come see if you can. God is truth. So he's saying, if you fix your mind, your intellectual mind on this enough, maybe you can contemplate God. Come, hold it in that first moment in which, so to speak, you caught a flash from the corner of your eye when the word truth was spoken. Oh yeah, there's something out there that I'm not thinking about. Stay there if you can, but you cannot. You slide back into these familiar and earthly things. And what weight is it, I ask, that drags you back? But the birdlime, this is one of his favorite metaphors, birdlime, like a bird gets stuck in lime. And it was a kind of trapping of birds. They when they put their feet in it, they can't separate themselves out, very much like a little mouse trap using glue. You're getting trapped in this. But the birdlime of greed for the filth, that the thing that drags you back is the birdlime of greed for the filth you have picked up in your wayward wanderings. So we can see there that even though he embraced the Bible account of the body being created by God and as created as good and destined for resurrection, it still is the place where we get trapped, and the soul gets trapped and weighed down and bogged down in earthly desires. So how did that happen? And the passage that we're going to look at now on the page, the facing page, describes it in detail. It describes how the soul really gets trapped in the body.
What page are you talking about, Tony?
We're moving over now to page 27, the next page. We're on page 26 in Latin numerals, then we're going over to page 27.
Thank
So
you.
he's talking about Adam and Eve. He's actually talking about our first parents who were naked in the garden and had everything they could possibly want and were happy. But then they were offered the fruit by the serpent. And it was Eve, the woman, who was first offered it. And there at the top of the page, he says, in Eve, there was in her that love of her own independent authority and a certain proud overconfidence in herself, as a result of which she took the fruit at the instigation of the serpent. So even though Adam also took the fruit, it was the first one who acted on her pride and independence was those of the female gender, and thereby hangs a tale, of course. But the story goes on. At the moment, so in the first full paragraph on page 27, at the moment the eyes of both parents are opened and they saw that they were naked. So the moment they take the fruit, bing, their eyes are opened and they see, oh my God, I got no clothes on. It's like a dream, it's like, and of course, Augustine is feeding on a lot of this stuff, about the fear of being naked, about what it means and the danger of it when you're naked in front of other people and what clothes do for you, all that stuff. All this is underlying, and he's not thinking about it, he's just writing it out because it works. So here's the moment of transformation. No sooner than they had transgressed the commandment, that is the commandment, do not eat of the fruit, then they were inwardly stripped stark naked, bereft of the grace which they had offended against by a kind of feverish delusion and by the proud love of their own independent authority. So the first point of sin is your independent authority. That's where sin comes from, begin with. You want to do it your way. That's where it begins. But once you do that, or once Adam and Eve did it, then they turned their eyes on their own genitals and lusted after them with that stirring movement they had not previously known. So, boom! Sexual arousal did not happen before the sin, before their decision to do things their way. Once they decided to do things their way, then they turn to their own bodies and especially the genitals, and they say, and they start lusting after themselves, and then they get physical arousal. When they forfeited this condition of immortality through the tree of life, then their bodies contracted that liability to disease and death, which is present in the flesh of animals. Before this point, we were deathless. We are actually due to get the tree of life, to eat from the tree of life, and so live forever. Death was not part of the equation. But once we made this choice for our own way and started lusting after our bodies, then we automatically became doomed to death. And thus also that motion of the genitals, which stirs in animals the desire to mate, and so ensures the birth of the young to take the place of those which die. So the circle is complete. The soul falls through its desire for its independence. It starts lusting after its own body, and then it's going to die because the point of the genitals is to create a new member of the species, to pass on the life, and then life is passed on, but you individually, you're going to die. So the circle happens by independence, self-will, fall, lust, death. That is the picture of human origins. There's one more piece in the equation to complete, and I talk about it overleaf on the next page. It is, well, that happened to Adam and Eve. Did it happen to me? I wasn't there. I didn't make that choice. But the way to complete the circle is that all of us were present in Adam. It now becomes Adam rather than Eve, because that's what Paul talks about in chapter 5 of Romans, that inasmuch as Adam sinned, death entered the world, inasmuch because Adam sinned, death entered the world, inasmuch as all have sinned, in Romans chapter 5. But he has a different translation, and it said, in him all had sinned, and so that was huge. That wasn't actually Jerome, although I think Jerome repeated that translation. It was a translation he was the old Latin translation that he had. So he decides, although he doesn't completely like the theory, but it's the theory that works, that each of us, that the soul of Adam is like a material spiritual thing that is passed on to each descendant of the human race. And each of us have a sliver of the soul of Adam in us. So each of us, yes, we did commit that sin. We did choose our independence over God, and we entered into the bodily realm and begun our life of physical lust. Each of it happened to all of us. And the reason why he said that had to be the case is because all of us suffer. So this is a kind of legal mentality that he had, that suffering can't be unmerited. It can't be a fact, just a fact, a brute fact. You must have done something wrong. So all the sufferings that we get in life, the miseries of our bodies, our toothaches, our sicknesses, COVID, our final death. There must be a fault behind all this. And the fault is original sin. The sin of Adam passed on to each of us. Now, I'm going to pause there and draw breath and drink a little of my tea. And ask you if you recognize any of that story.
Well, I recognize the story because I grew up with that story. Augustine has influenced me right up to probably, some time ago when I met you, because that's the foundational story, not just of Catholics, but Protestants. It's what I was taught in seminary. It's what I taught for a number of years as a pastor. So you're talking about something that is personally very relevant.
So you taught original sin.
That's right.
Right. And every Christian pastor and teacher, Catholic or Protestant, taught original sin. And it's not just like, we all got off to a bad start. No, there was the sin of Adam. That's the sin. And that's the way it's communicated. And that's what anybody else?
I think it's really interesting that when you say the moment that they had their own independence and authority, then they looked at their genitals and began lusting for themselves, because that was never unpacked for me as to why sex is bad. And that I feel like this is such it needs such a reboot, it's such an old computer system that we're trying to understand who we are and who God is. It's so archaic. And that thing that it was when they had their own authority, then he brought that, then through it was his making sense of evil, right? And why people suffer. So it's so interesting. I really, it's very freeing to hear it laid out like that, because you can see you're reading this very old manual, this very old model that made sense at one time, thousands or hundreds of years ago.
Well, actually, it made sense 2,000 years ago, but it still made sense 50 years ago, because that's what I was taught, and that's what.
Right. But having learned, having learned from you and this whole idea, the anthropology of it, and the generative violence, and what that is actually about, is not about having their own authority, and making a decision. It's about desire. It's about desire, and freeing it from the whole Augustinian
and Platinian,
Platinian,
Plotinus, his scheme of things that helped Augustine make sense of the material world and of the suffering. And you got to remember that war is a big part of this. The Romans are always at war. People are always being killed. Cities are being burned. Children are being killed. That's all part of the whole scene. And he's not changing that. He's not challenging that. That's the way of it, because he's actually a Roman, and Rome is now Christian. So Roman imperial power is now a Christian power. So he's not challenging that, but he makes sense of it in this way. Dana, turn on.
I was, as you were telling laying the whole story out, it was so interesting. I agree with Heather, because I remember as a child being taught the original sin, and of course I was a child. So how did from my Sunday school teacher or whoever, I don't even remember the first person.
Yeah, that's right.
I just remember thinking that is weird. I don't understand that. I just didn't relate to it as a little girl. And it didn't make sense, but that's just kind of how it was.
Yes, it's totally how it was.
I'm understanding like this was a way to try to understand the world. So hearing this in the way that he interprets it is very depressing. That's a very depressing interpretation. So it's just not only strange, it's very like, oh, just I don't know.
It's not very
So,
romantic. We say it's not romantic. I mean, it's sexual. It's graphic. It's dirty, and it's
Yeah.
and it's going to die.
Yeah, it's very dark. It's a very dark way of understanding humanity, humans or human nature, I suppose. So I can't wait to hear the second part of this study.
Well, the point, Dana, is that we've already been telling that story all the way
That's
through, right? From the alternative story is that we are relational beings right from the get-go. Our desire is mimetic. We learn from that we committed acts of violence to begin with. This is the Girardian scheme that created culture. But then Jesus came to try to show to direct our desire in a different way. But it's all within this world frame. It's not to do with a soul coming from another realm and making all these very serious mistakes and creating this disaster that we're all in. Kathy.
Which your interpretation while we're waiting for, Tony,
Yeah, go ahead.
is while we're waiting for Mom, your interpretation and the way that you're laying this out is extremely helpful, and it makes a ton of sense. So
No,
I
thank you, Dana. Oh, Kathy, are you there? Okay, off you go, Kathy. You have to turn on, Kathy, demute. Yeah.
Okay. I kind of lost several of you because my screen was freezing up. But I don't know for sure if anyone said this, but I think probably it has been. But if you're going to be a Christian, this is the Christian, the whole Christianity. So, you know, I guess if you have to embrace the best part of Jesus has come as our savior, you have to almost say, well, I'm just going to ignore that, the rest of it, because it doesn't make sense. I've always thought it didn't make sense, but it's my belief. I'm a Christian.
You were taught that.
Yeah, I'm a Christian. I mean, that's what we're all taught. Everybody's taught that. So, but I was just going to say something funny. I guess we needed original sin to be able to reproduce our world.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But he says that we wouldn't have died. I don't know where they would have just been Adam and Eve, really. I mean, just walking around in their supreme kind of like isolation. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that doesn't make sense either. It doesn't fit with life.
No, none of it makes sense. Why were we all never going to die? I mean, none of it makes sense.
So, Maggie.
His viewpoint to me is a hopeless viewpoint, and it's non-loving. That's why it's disturbing to me. It doesn't seem very loving at all, and hopeless.
Well, it doesn't, it's not body. The human body is not valued.
No, exactly right, Heather. That is exactly right. So,
and that's why there's no love.
There you go. So when your dad, that is Kathy's husband and Dana's dad too, goes off and starts doing his yoga, which is to do with the body, which is to do with basically the divine spiritual character of the body. It's not a separate thing. That is bad and that is condemned because it goes against that very powerful old story. So we understand where that condemnation came from. So when Heather does her Jesus yoga, we're telling a different story. We're telling a different story about the body and the material world. So that's the point of going back to this introduction, is to show, after we've gone through Exodus, Genesis, Isaiah, Daniel, Jesus, Paul, say, can you see that we have told a different story? It's God slowly, progressively entering into our world, which is a world of desire and violence. It doesn't say how it got to be that way. It doesn't try to explain how it got to be, because the material world, the creation as we know it is that way. But we could say that the way I explain it is that God, that creation is a half-finished process, that creation has only just really begun, and that the story that we read in the Bible is about God's work in finishing his creation, and his creation is finished in the new creation. But when Jesus teaches us about love, that brings the creation. So when the creation gets to the point of getting rid of its violence, then creation will be, it'll be like the seventh day, and creation will be complete. So rather than saying God made everything right at the beginning, which you would get if you just read Genesis chapter 1 chronologically, like, yes, that was there first, then the next bit came after it, then the next bit came after that. No, we say you have to read it from later on. There's been those bits being put there at the beginning later on, because they've come to better understandings later on. The earlier understandings are the more primitive ones, and that everything is not smoothly chronological in the actual composition of the canon. So you have to have a critical viewpoint about the composition of the Bible to free yourself from that kind of literal and kind of childish and, as you say, loveless point of view, that is all made good at the beginning, and then we completely messed it up, and it had to be our fault, and therefore we have to have a bit of Adam in us, and therefore, you know, we are going to die, and we need Jesus to save us from that. So you have to have compassion, love, and a critical viewpoint as well to get to the story of creation and recreation, and the excitement, the newness of saying, well, actually, all of us in our little way are part of completing the story of creation. You know, in doing our part in bringing love into the realm of desire, bringing love and nonviolence into the realm of desire. That's what finally brings about the fulfillment of creation. So you can see now, my dear friends, my sisters and brothers, how there are two stories. How at least there are at least two stories. You know, that we are told a certain story. We're told a certain story from our childhood, from our mother's milk, and now over these past, whatever it is, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, another story, especially since the violence of the 20th century. I think in a way, the atomic bomb has done us a favor. It's kind of wakened us up to the reality of violence, and how we need to think about ourselves and violence as a core issue, rather than the spirit, the soul falling into the body. It's all a big mistake. We need to get back to heaven.
It's
Go
so
ahead.
sad, the misinterpretation that took place all these years. And through your wisdom and working with Jesus to bring forth the more loving reality story is what we all need. And thank you for bringing this forward, because, you know, all these past years, you know, who knows, like from what this guy from as a kid, you know, I don't know what he went through, but unfortunately for somehow he misinterpreted things. And that kind of led us down the wrong path for many years. So that saddens me. But
Yes,
now we have hope.
we have
in this
hope.
new story.
And we have to remember that Augustine didn't get there on his own. There were lots of other influences. It was his time, his world. It would be, like Rome wouldn't have written to him and said, "Oh, you're the greatest," unless it kind of made sense in his world. And for me to be able to have an alternate point of view, I didn't get this in any manner on my own. I depended on a lot of other things, and a lot of teachers and other wisdom, and the Holy Spirit.
And see, that in itself is loving, because you even brought love into his reality and where he got to his decisions and thoughts about this.
Right.
So you were even showing him love. So,
yeah, really. Yeah. And on Friday night, on the discussion, we have people to defend Augustine, and because they love him. I mean, if you read his Confessions, that's his best book, really. It makes you want to love God, and it makes you want to love him. I mean, he was capable of I mean, I've shown really the dirty bits. I got the dirty laundry out, unfortunately. But you have to see that. You have to be shown that in order to get a full if that's hidden away, you don't get a proper understanding of where we have come from,
Yeah, you have to see the parts of your theology that are colluding with the violent world systems.
Yes,
that has to be laid bare,
Yeah.
And I feel like there's all these different realities that we create, but the one reality, I feel like the true reality is the one that would exist if nobody were creating it. It's just the truth, it's so there has to be something that just exists, because Lord knows, we all have the system when we see something, like this symbol or the sign, through the semiotics, as you were teaching, we take from things as we need. We are blind to a lot of things. We Absolutely. We really don't know. But what this Bible study has taught me is to have faith in, and to have deep faith into that reality that doesn't exist if humans create it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because that's a reality of love,
yes,
of endless love. And Jesus shows us that,
That's exactly right. So those two things, the only thing that would make sense ultimately is endless love. And how do you put that all together with this kind of mess we're in? Well, we've got Jesus. You see that? So you put those things together, you say, oh yeah, that version of the story makes sense. That there is somebody, or there is a story beginning with Genesis and Exodus that is God trying to show God's self as endless love. And so we have to kind of draw things a little bit to a conclusion today, and I'm very sorry, and I have to do penance for this, that I got started off. So that's my Augustinian heritage, saying I have to do penance for my starting late. But the point is that we are actually we can be grateful and happy about the situation that we're in, that we're part of a learning curve, right? The human learning curve. And we've arrived at this point where we can have a discussion like we just had, and look at Augustine and think in those terms. It's not to demean or damn Augustine, not at all. I mean, he's one figure. He was very, very, very influential, but he's just one figure. He's a human being. And there are others along the journey, but we're part of that. And our situation today is of being closer, I think, to that endless love story than he was back then. And we have a much clearer understanding of the role of violence in our world, the role of mimetic desire, not desire for love. This is, the desire that is, when desire is transformed in us into love, mimetic desire and violence, that creates the world order that we're in. And we are at a crisis of that. We're at a crisis point of a world of violence. But this other story, the story of God who wants to recreate, to create by recreating, by bringing us into the project. You see what I mean? It's not we're just pawns. We have a very crucial role in bringing this creation to fullness, to fulfillment. So it's a great time, should we say, to be alive in its way. Jerry, any last thoughts, Mr. Jerry?
Well, just that this is a great reminder of the importance of getting the violence out of God and finding that from the very beginning, there's a nonviolent strain. As you've pointed out, there are two stories, and we're emphasizing, and we need to keep emphasizing the nonviolent story that and get the violence out of God.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you. That's right. I mean, it seems a bit of a contradiction to say, well, you know, we have to get violence out of God. No, it's get the violence out of the way we understand God, you know, and the way we have constructed God. But this truth that Heather was talking about, that is always there, it's the only thing that makes sense, that we didn't create. That's a beautiful way of thinking about it. You know, when we have a hand in making something, we'll probably make something pretty messed up, you know, if it's me who's creating it. But if there's something that we didn't create and that touches us through that story, through the story of the nonviolent God and Jesus, then we can have trust in that and faith in that. So thank you. Now I'm afraid I have to leave. I have to go. And thank you for being faithful, for turning up, even though the teacher did not show up on time. Have a great day. Would someone like to bless us before we go?
Dear gracious God, thank you for this wonderful book study on signs of change. Help us to present this understanding in our world of violence that God is nonviolent. Bless everyone. Have a great week. God bless us all. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Peace to everyone. Have a great day.